Approve the Teck oil sands mine or send Western alienation to a, quote, boiling point. That's the warning issued by Alberta Premier Jason Kenney in a new letter to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. The proposed $20 billion project is awaiting federal government approval. The company behind it, Teck Resources, wants to build the frontier mine north of Fort McMurray. It would produce 260,000 barrels of oil a day and create nearly 10,000 jobs, according to the company, over about a decade long. The company estimates the mine will emit 4.1 megatons of carbon dioxide a year over its 4 decades in operation. The feds say fighting the effects of climate change, of course, is one of their top priorities. So what is Cabinet going to do about the oil sands project? Jonathan Wilkinson is the Minister of Environment and Climate Change. He joins us now from Vancouver. Hi, Minister Wilkinson. Thanks for making time for us.
No problem.
Premier Kenney wrote in that letter to the Prime Minister, there is, quote, quite simply, no reason specific to this project that would justify denying federal cabinet approval for the Frontier project. Do you agree?
Well, I think the one thing on which Premier Kenney and I would agree is that on a go-forward basis, we need to ensure that Canada's energy resources are as clean as they possibly can be and are amongst the cleanest in the world. As we go through an energy transition. And that is the lens that we will be using to evaluate this project. That is, I think, entirely appropriate and is exactly what we are intended to do as a government, and I think Canadians would expect no less.
His essential point, I think, in the letter, and my read of it is, and what he's been saying, what we've heard from him and proponents of the project is essentially, look, a joint review panel looked through all this. It's gone through the regulatory process, and at the end of the day, that panel concluded that this was in the public interest. Why would Cabinet decide otherwise?
Well, first of all, the process leaves the decision with Cabinet for very good reason, which is that elected officials need to look at all of the available information, all of the effects, both environmental and economic, in assessing whether this is truly in the public interest. The Joint Review Panel actually pointed out significant negative adverse environmental impacts, including impacts on biodiversity and on First Nations communities. One of the other things that people should be aware of is the Joint Review Panel essentially said that greenhouse gas emissions from the project would make the accomplishment of Canada's 2030 and 2050 targets much more difficult, and that greenhouse gases were beyond the scope of the project. So they didn't even opine on that. At the end of the day, greenhouse gases, as well as other environmental impacts, are certainly things that from a public policy perspective, the federal cabinet needs to weigh in determining whether or not this project should proceed.
Yeah, the exact, I remember reading the paragraph, I think what it said was that it may, in outlining how big the emissions would be, 4 million tons a year, it said it may make it more difficult to reach those targets. When you say that that is something that Cabinet will have to take into account, will you also be taking into account the economic viability or lack thereof of the project? Do you see that as Cabinet's role?
Well, I think, certainly we look at the potential economic benefits associated with a project of this type. We do look at, the circumstances in which this project exists. I think the CEO of Teck was pretty clear last week when he said that there are a number of things that would need to come to fruition in order for the project, if approved, to get built. One of those certainly was price. The company ran all of the economics associated with the benefits of the project at $92 oil, which is significantly higher than where oil is trading today. And of course, you would need that price of oil on a sustained basis. So those factors are relevant, but I would tell you that the most significant issues are ensuring that we can actually thoughtfully address the environmental impacts. That is what an environmental assessment process is to do, is to point out where those impacts happen and what could be done to mitigate those. And that is certainly front and center for us in the context of thinking about this project.
Proponents of the project, including, for example, the Alberta government and Premier Kenney, I think would say, why do we have this burdensome regulatory process, one that, we champion as emblematic of the way business should be done in Canada? Why do we have that if this company jumps through all those hoops, gets an endorsement essentially by a joint review panel, and that can quickly be cast aside because Cabinet has other considerations?
Well, first of all, I would go back to the fact that the Joint Review Panel did point out some of the significant environmental impacts, and they did actually go beyond the paragraph that you quoted to say that greenhouse gas emissions and the assessment of those impacts were beyond the scope of what they were asked to do. So that would be number one. And certainly, I think most Canadians would agree that greenhouse gas emissions are absolutely relevant to the assessment of whether a project like this should proceed. But in terms of the process, we agree that a lot of these issues should be actually addressed earlier in the process. That is why we developed a new environmental assessment process called the impact assessment process, which has just been put into place. This project was reviewed under SIA 2012, which was the process put into place by Mr. Kenney and Mr. Harper.
And so you're saying that it's inferior to the one that you've put in place? We don't
It's
know for sure. We don't know for
it's
sure how that one will work because you haven't. There aren't any regulations out. Regulations which your government has said might address some of the concerns coming from Alberta and other industry officials.
Right, but what we also have said is that early in the process, we need to flag the major issues that actually do need to be addressed and considered, and they need to be thought of early on, including things like impacts on Indigenous communities, including issues around climate change. As I say, the Joint Review Panel found that the climate issues were beyond the scope of what they were doing. That will not be the case in the context of the Impact Assessment Agency.
Does that change the way then in which you view the Joint Review Panel's work, the conclusions that it reached?
Well, I think that the Joint Review Panel did thoughtful work in terms of highlighting some of the impacts as well as highlighting some of the economic benefits. It did very clearly say that some elements of the environmental impacts were beyond the scope of what they've been asked to do. So it's very useful input into what needs to be a very thoughtful and considered debate and discussion around the cabinet table about whether or not this project should proceed, and if it is to proceed, under what conditions.
In the letter, Premier Kenney indicated that he feels, and his government feels, that the discussion has shifted to this idea of net zero, the promise that your party made during the campaign, and that there is some sort of discussion about Alberta, for example, legislating a move to net zero by 2050. Is that in the vein of something that your government is considering?
Well, certainly we made the commitment to net zero. We're not alone. There are 77 countries around the world that have already made that commitment. We also made commitments to achieving certain reductions in greenhouse gases by 2030. Those are all very relevant. I would say that we are interested in a constructive conversation with Premier Kenney and his government around how they're going to ensure that the 100 megaton cap actually is put into place such that there are regulations to ensure that's the case. How we move towards a net zero future, which is something that Teck, for example, is committed to do, but so has Cenovus and Suncor and a number of others. So we are very interested in thoughtful and constructive conversations about how we make significant progress on the climate file and do so in a way that supports economic progress. So
would you like to see Alberta, for example, legislate a move to net zero by 2050 in line with your government? And if so, their government's contention is that yours has provided few details on what kind of expectations you have, even for your own government.
Absolutely, and the discussion around net zero by 2050 is something that we have promised Canadians we would be coming forward with an expert panel to help define those pathways. We welcome the participation of Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, all provinces and territories with Indigenous peoples in helping us to define those pathways. But there's certainly short-term things that we can all do in terms of having a climate target, in terms of having a robust climate plan. In Alberta's case, in terms of ensuring that the regulations are in place to make sure that the emissions cap that was put into place by the previous Alberta government, but was part of the conversations that enabled the approval of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, to ensure those things are in place on a go-forward basis. Canadians
just to interrupt for a second, though, with respect, Minister, that cap remains in essence in the exact same place it was under the Notley government. It lacked regulation then; it lacks regulation now. I'm just trying to get at specifically what you're looking for. Would you like regulations for that cap?
Yes, absolutely. Premier Notley promised to put in place regulation. She did not manage to do so before she was defeated in the election. We have certainly always been looking for regulations to be put into place. If you actually take, the 100 megaton emissions cap was something that was very important in the context of actually putting together Canada's climate plan and enabling the approval of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. At this point, with no regulations, there's no way to enforce that cap. If you take all of the various projects that have already been approved in the oil sands and you assume all of them get built, you're talking about 130 megatons. So yes,
but they're well below it now, right? And the contention is that even with Frontier, they'll still remain below it.
Well, our modeling shows that we're actually approaching the 100 megaton cap in 2030, and that doesn't assume all of these projects go ahead. If you take all of the approved projects, already approved, take Teck Frontier out of it, if they all get built, it's 130 megatons. So are the regulations important to ensure the cap's not exceeded? Of course they are.
Before I let you go, one final quick question. We're speaking with Chief Alan Adam of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, who's concerned about his own, he's in favor of the project initially, but has a few things that, environmental effects that he would like mitigated. He doesn't feel the Alberta government has mitigated those. I conducted the interview already, it's going to air later, but he specifically said that he's looking for your government to, if you do approve this, to conditionally do so and make sure that there's some way of forcing the provincial government to sit down with Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation. Is that under consideration from your perspective?
Well, I think we've all learned a lot about consultation and accommodation over the last number of years. It is extremely important for us to do so, both ethically, morally, but also legally. Certainly we saw that in the context of the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, where the government needed to go back and redo consultation and accommodation discussions because there was a sense that they were not done to a deep enough level. So I would certainly encourage the government of Alberta to engage the conversations with the local First Nations in a manner that ensures that the consultations are deep and that there is a sincere attempt to accommodate.
Will there be a decision by the end of February, or is the option of delaying that decision still on the table?
So this is a decision of Cabinet. It is not my decision. I would say that under CA 2012, the Cabinet has the ability to approve with conditions. It has the ability to reject, and it has the ability to defer if it feels that it needs some time, additional time, for one reason or another. I'm not going to opine on what the decision of my colleagues will be, but I will tell you that it will be a fulsome discussion, and we will be taking into account all of the relevant information.
But a delay is not officially off the table.
None of the options are officially on, or none of the options are off the table.
Okay, thank you so much, Minister. Appreciate your time this evening.
All right, thank you.
Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Jonathan Wilkinson. Welcome back to Power and Politics with the Power Panel. Nigan Sinclair, Melissa Lantsman, Brad Levine, Yolande James, and JP Tasker. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney has written to the Prime Minister about the Teck Frontier oil sands mine. He's warning that a cabinet rejection of the plan would devastate the province's economy and inflame Western alienation. Melissa, I'm going to start with you. We had Minister Wilkinson on, the federal environment minister, to respond to that. His main thesis, I was just talking about with JP, that he put forward in this was, the point that Jason Kenney's making is a joint review panel made a decision on this mine. They said it's in the public interest. Minister Wilkinson's main thesis, it appeared to me, or the point that he put forward today was that, okay, yes, that's fine, but it also, in its report, admitted that the mine and its operation would make it harder to meet our climate targets. And as well, it didn't take that into account in rendering its decision, like that is outlined by the Joint Review Panel. That tells me that Cabinet is taking a lot more than this review panel into account when it makes its decision. What does it tell you?
That tells me that Cabinet's sort of kicking the tires or putting out a few trial balloons to see
a different way of putting it, yeah.
how badly this might go over. Look, if they don't approve the Teck project, this says, Alberta, we don't necessarily care about you. This says to foreign investors, like Premier Kenney has been saying, that this is not a safe place to invest, even though you've gone through the regulatory, you've put all the work in on the front end, you've spent a lot of time here, you've invested a lot of money in Canada, and yet the government's still going to make decisions without facts and based on ideology. And it also says that maybe if this was in another part of the country, like let's say in Quebec, that maybe you wouldn't be having this problem. And because it's in Alberta and the federal government is currently having a fight with Alberta, that you're not welcome here.
Okay, let me challenge you for 1 second on the that they're going to just make a sort of willy-nilly decision based on nothing. I mean, it is true in the report that it says it will make it harder for Canada to reach its climate targets. It's also true that wasn't part of the assessment that was made. I'm not taking away from your points on the economics of it all, but aren't they allowed to take that into account?
Yeah, I don't think they're making willy-nilly decisions. I think they're making very deeply ideological decisions, saying that Alberta, your resource sector, is not part of how we're going to go forward in the future, and this is sort of the final nail in the coffin.
Brad, would you agree? I'm trying to read your eyebrows, your furrow there, but I'm not sure
I'm listening. I'm listening with great intent.
Yes. Okay, that's it.
And just for full disclosure, myself, my firm, we work with the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation on this issue as well as
the chief of that First Nation on.
And Chief Adam is coming on. Very good. Look. First of all, I don't believe. I mean, the federal government, the federal cabinet. What's fascinating about the decision before on the Teck mine is fundamentally different from that of TMX. I was thinking back to the Trans Mountain Pipeline. It seemed as though the Liberals were kind of united. There was little dissension. And here we're hearing reports coming out of that cabinet that there is a lot of disagreement and opposition for Minister Wilkinson to give the green light. Will he give the green light before the deadline? That is unknown, and I'm sure Chief Adam will address this. He was not advocating that Minister Wilkinson punted to the future. He was saying that as things are going now with the conversations that the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation is having with Canada is going very well, but the conversations that they're having at the table with the province of Alberta is going very slowly, and there are a tremendous amount of outstanding fundamental issues. And with only a handful of weeks left in this, it's actually Jason Kenney who is running the risk of potentially harming this project. So it's I think that the Chief Adam and the federal government seem to be on relatively the same page. It's actually Jason Kenney, in the eyes of the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation, who is dragging his heels on this. And so it's interesting to see Mr. Kenney talk about how Ottawa has got to hurry up when he himself at his own mitigation table with First Nations is actually not coming to the table.
Just to let our viewers know, the contention from Chief Alan Adam is that there have not been substantial meetings between his First Nation and the government, and he's outlined a number of the provincial government. He's outlined a number of specific environmental concerns. The provincial government does contend, though, I want to be fair, that those conversations are ongoing, and they listed to my colleague David Thurton a number of accommodations that they are willing to make. What he has asked, and you'll hear this, I taped the interview a little bit earlier, full disclosure, what you'll hear him say is that he has asked that the federal government conditionally approve the mine and attach to an approval a condition by which the provincial government has to meaningfully, essentially meet and speak with him and make a meaningful attempt to accommodate those concerns. So that is how he outlined it. I want to play the clip of Chief Adam really quickly, and then we'll get some other reaction.
Does Jason Kenney want this project to go ahead, or are they just pointing the finger at the Canadian government and also pointing the finger at ACFN, stating to the fact and telling Albertans and Canadians alike that these are the problems in regards to Teck not moving forward, but in reality, the only person that's holding up the Teck resource approval, in my view and the view of the general public, is the Alberta government, because they failed to meet and mitigate the table that was set up 2 years ago, and I think they've only met probably once or twice, and that's not meaningful consultation in my view.
So again, the press secretary to the provincial environment minister did say that there are conversations and that there is a whole list of things that they're willing to accommodate. Nigan, let me get you in though. Again, how much more difficult does this make it for the cabinet? We already know from my own conversations and from lots of other reporting, as Brad alluded to, there's a lot of disagreement around that table already about this project.
Oh, this is a perfect example of a one issue being people drawing upon the politics of 14 other issues to all come into one situation. This is a situation where suddenly we're talking about Wexit again, and then we're talking about the issue of consultation again. I mean, I think that the cabinet is being proactive in the situation. I happen to know that Chief Adam is not alone in the concerns of the benefit agreements. That they have signed the benefit agreements of all, I believe it's 14 yes, First Nations 14. In and around that area. And so, I mean, generally the benefit agreements, I don't hear a ton of areas in terms of the grassroots kind of movement that is against Trans Mountain, for example, Coastal GasLink. It doesn't mean that isn't there, of course, in terms of the reaction that we kind of see in the issue of Coastal GasLink involving traditional people and then Indian Act chiefs and councils. But there is the big issue involving consultation on the front end versus the back end. And this is a good example in which when you put a provincial government in charge, the provincial government has no legal obligation or interest, for the most part, in engaging with the First Nation on a meaningful basis, and so was really marching Canada to a court action involving the lack of consultation with the First Nation or the inclusion of them within the discussion of the creation of the project.
Yolande, does this continue to be one of the hardest things the government has to decide? What do you make of all the various, I mean, we had Julie DeBruzen on the show, a Liberal MP from Toronto Danforth, who openly talked about her opposition to the project on Friday.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely, and there's a lot of there are a lot of good reasons for that. I mean, first, let's step back for a minute here. It's far from being clear to me, anyway, from what I've read and what I've seen, that even out west, even in Alberta, that this is a project that is that everybody is unanimously pushing forward. Where Jason Kenney has shown his political muscle and experience is trying to position that by sending this letter to the Prime Minister, is trying to position this approval of the project as a referendum as to whether the federal government is serious about fixing its relationship with Alberta, when in fact, as we've heard, whether it's respect to First Nations or even the viability of the project, there are a lot more issues with respect to that. As to how the cabinet should move forward, I just think that you have to make the comparison with what happened with Trans Mountain. Let's not forget that when that project was authorized and was approved, and even when the government went as far as buying the pipeline, they got no recognition from Jason Kenney, no points for saying, okay, we're trying to do something, and at great cost to a lot of people that have made sure that the government is still in government now.
Points, or were they supposed to be doing that for points, or because they thought it was the right thing to do?
No, it's not just a question about doing it for points. The people that were saying that, it's a question about credibility. It's a question about saying, okay, if we're serious about being carbon neutral until 2050, how is that going to happen? That has to be, you have to have a credible message. I mean, I'm giving you not only the political repercussions, but they have to be thinking about how are we going to make sure that the people, not only in Quebec, but in the 60% of people who hesitated but still re-elected the Liberals, how are they going to approve this project and still say we're serious about reducing carbon emissions? And if they can factually present that and authorize this project, then I guess they'd go ahead. But if I look back to what happened with Trans Mountain, it certainly did not go down that way of trying to compromise.
Here's where I see, JP, one point. I sort of understand the point that Jason Kenney is making. He seems in this letter, and his government has indicated kind of prior that, okay, you want to shift this conversation to net zero by 2050. Okay, we're willing to have that discussion, but you have yet to provide us with the details about your plan that we could then formulate our plan around. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but to be fair, like, we don't even know, the government made this proposal during the election, and we don't even have the details from them, the federal government, on how they're planning to get there. I understand the sentiment. I understand that they have to consider those targets when making this decision. That is a no-brainer to me, but there's a point to be made as well about they don't really have a plan for 2050 either.
No, I mean, they threw that out during the last election campaign, and we really haven't heard anything about that promise since. And I think Jason Kenney is sensing that things aren't going to go his way by issuing this letter today. When you read through the 4 pages, it's clear he already knows what the answer is going to be from the Liberal cabinet, or what he's projecting the answer will be. And that's because of those Liberal backbenchers that we've seen on your show and other places. They're all coming out against this. They're opposed to it. This is a battle that went on last week in caucus. We've spoken to people who told us that there are really 3/4 of the caucus against this project, the other quarter with a few cabinet ministers thrown in who are on side with the project. But it's that net zero promise that is in the crosshairs here, because all these people went out on the campaign trail last fall saying, we're climate fighters, we believe in the environment, and we're going to do something about it. But they kept being met with people saying, but you bought a pipeline, you bought Trans Mountain.
To Yolande's point.
Point. So when you add on the Frontier Teck mine, it's going to make it an even tougher sell next time around, which might be sooner rather than later in a minority government. So they're sensing that they're going to have trouble at the doorstep in Montreal and Toronto and perhaps even places like Winnipeg when they buy or when they approve something like this, such a massive project. But at the same time, Kenny's right. There is no plan on net zero. Initially, the target was keep it below that 100 megatons cap, and you can build, you can keep going. Let's approve more projects as long as it's below that 100 megatons cap, which is really critical to getting our Paris climate targets reached. That's clearly not their message anymore. It is now falling back on the net zero. And what does that look like? We don't know. It's just this pie in the sky idea that, in 30 years' time, we'll be doing nothing in terms of emissions, and all the emissions we do will be offset by trees. But what does that mean for natural resources development? As he says, that slams the door to international investment. So it's a real Tough call.
Yeah. Alberta is warning Ottawa approve the Teck oil sands mine or send Western alienation to a, quote, boiling point. Premier Jason Kenney made that request in a new letter to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. The proposed $20 billion project is currently awaiting federal cabinet approval. One of Kenney's selling points has been that 14 Indigenous communities endorsed the project, but at least one of them is now not so sure. Hi, Chief Adam. Nice to see you. Thanks for making time for us.
For sure.
Chief, I wanted to start off by asking you if you could outline for myself and for our viewers what your main concerns are when it comes to the Teck mine.
When it comes to the Teck mine resources, the main criteria that we have as an issue is the Water and Navigational Act, which gives us access to waterways, which is written in the contents of the treaty. Well, and the other thing is that, we want to make sure that the woodland buffalo is protected because it's the only living species that's from its original habitat. It wasn't brought in by the Alberta government or by the Canadian government in regards to developing the Wood Buffalo National Park like they did in Wood Buffalo National Park, which they brought it buffaloes from Wainwright at the time back in the 20s and 30s. And this wood buffalo herd is the original buffalo herd that's been there since time immemorial, and they're only down to maybe less than 300, and they need to be protected. And those are one of the issues as well, and also the woodland caribou that need protection as well, that circulate in the same area, and we just want to assure that. Those get addressed because those are meaningful in the contents of Treaty Number 8, which we've signed cohesion to in mid-summer of 1900, cohesion to 1899.
And what is the status of your conversations with the province specific to those concerns? Like, how are those conversations going?
Well, I could honestly say that the conversations that we're having, because we have two tables set up, we have one table set up with the federal government, and that was set up 2 years ago. I am very happy to say that, the federal government table is just about concluded. Like, we probably have maybe one or two tables left to sit down, and we would be able to walk away with a plan in place. But when it comes to the Alberta government, in the last 2 years, they've been missing from the table. They feel that they don't have to consult with the First Nation. They feel that everything's being addressed. But you got to understand that the province holds regulatory certainty, and they give regulatory approvals to industry and to governments which go against our treaty rights. So therefore, we've asked the Alberta government to step in and, be responsible for some of the approvals that they've been given out and mitigate with ACFN. But it seems to be that the Alberta government does not want to mitigate in any way when it comes to dealing with First Nations issues, and that becomes a problem.
And so are you hopeful that until the government, as you outlined, responds to your concerns, to the concerns that you've put forward, that the federal government delay its ultimate decision where Teck mine is concerned?
Well, I think at this point in time, when it comes to that position, it's very sad that, ACFN and the federal government worked out our issues, and we've come to the table. We've, worked really hard to address all of our concerns, and, Canada, representing the Canadian citizens as a whole, mitigated their table, and we're just about ready for, a sign-off, and yet Alberta government has certain provisions in the agreement that they also have to mitigate, which they haven't even did one thing at all leading up to today, which tells me that Premier Kenney is pointing the finger at Ottawa, or he's pointing the finger at ACFN, stating to the fact that if this project doesn't get approved, it's Canada's fault. If it doesn't get approved because of First Nation interference, it's because of ACFN's fault. Well, the true matter is that Jason Kenney and the UCP government for Alberta failed to accommodate ACFN's needs. So therefore, that begs to differ. Does Jason Kenney want this project to go ahead, or are they just pointing the finger at the Canadian government and also pointing the finger at ACFN, stating to the fact and telling Albertans and Canadians alike that these are the problems in regards to Teck not moving forward, but in reality, the only person that's holding up the Teck resource approval, in my view and the view of the general public, is the Alberta government, because they failed to meet and mitigate the table that was set up 2 years ago, and I think they've only met probably once or twice, and that's not meaningful consultation in my view.
Let me just put to you what my colleague David Thurton, who worked on a piece over the weekend on this, got from the press secretary to Alberta's environment minister. We recognize that Chief Adam intends to drive a hard bargain, as should any official representing his constituents. However, the government of Alberta must carefully consider the interests of Alberta taxpayers. She went on to say that the province continues to engage with ACFN, my apologies, and is open to increasing the number of water monitoring stations, allowing for and funding Indigenous management of bison, and creating new protected areas. Your response to that, sir?
My response to that is that we have less than 30 days to accommodate to this table. With no credible plans in place whatsoever, we cannot go to the federal government and ask the federal government to give approval on this Teck Resources, which is going to be the biggest open pit mine in the world, and it just happens to be 15,000 meters from our reserve, and that's very close, and it's very alarming to us. So if Mr. Kenney thinks that failing to accommodate to our table and put blame on us is not going to go nowhere, no.
Can I ask you once more, if you don't mind, if in fact things continue status quo and you don't, for example, get the accommodation from the province that you're looking for, are you specifically asking the federal government to delay making their decision, if that remains the case?
If the province of Alberta doesn't want to sit down seriously and finalize this mitigation table within a week or so, I strongly encourage the federal government, to look at conditional approval, but at this point in time, ACFN, we signed an agreement with Teck a little over a year ago. We were the last ones holding out. We were prepared to go to the hearing, and it just so happens that we sat down amongst ourselves as nations people, and we said that if we were to be left out of this one, we will gain no benefits from it. But when we sat down and made the agreement, there were certain provisions when we sat with Teck Resources that these mitigation tables would have to happen before approval was granted, and the Alberta government failed to mitigate their table.
And when you say that you hope the federal government seriously considers conditional approval, what exactly would that mean?
Well, it gives conditional approval to the Alberta, to the project based on the fact that, Alberta has a time frame to make sure that they sit down with ACFN to address ACFN's concerns. If not, well then, what is the point in all this?
Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you, Chief Adam, for your time this evening. I really appreciate it.
Okay, then, thank you.
Alan Adam is the chief of the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.